Introducing G-Core Managed Kubernetes, the ultimate solution for streamlined Kubernetes management. Experience support for bare metal nodes and a robust 99.9 uptime SLA at no extra cost. Provision Kubernetes clusters effortlessly with a single click using their intuitive dashboard, API, or Terraform. Seamlessly integrate with G-Core external DNS and easily provision block volume storage for your requirements. And of course, stay up to date with the latest Kubernetes versions. Plus, they have an exclusive offer just for you. Click the G-Core link in the show notes and use promo code CLOUDCAST and receive €100 credit to try G-Core services today. That's promo code CLOUDCAST to receive €100 credit on your G-Core services today.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody's doing well. We're getting towards the end of July 2023 and another Sunday Perspective show. Hope everybody is having a good July. Hope everybody is maybe getting some downtime, some vacation time. I know I did for the last week or so. And so this show is going to be a little bit different because quite honestly, I did not spend a lot of time thinking about technology over the last week. I spent about a half a week, about 4 days out in Grand Tetons, which is in the western part of the United States. It is a incredibly beautiful part of the United States. It's a area that is kind of dominated by just huge mountains, national parks, just unbelievably beautiful terrain and wildlife, buffalo and moose and elk and deer and all sorts of things like that. Anyways, the reason I'm going to kind of talk about that today is, like I said, I spent most of the week not at all thinking about the podcast, not at all thinking about technology. But as I was flying home, I thought to myself, well, I have a podcast to do, so I have to come up with something for Sunday Perspectives. And there was a story as part of us spending a week out amongst nature and sort of not only kind of taking it in and experiencing it, but also hearing about the history of it, that I thought really kind of had an interesting intersection with some of the discussions, both pros and cons discussions that have been going on over the last week or so around technology and technology communities' relationship with free, whatever free means in various contexts. So I thought what I would do on this week's show is kind of blend together, weave together this interesting story that I heard throughout the week out in Grand Tetons, and just some perspective on some of the discussions around free and open and business models and not business models and what's good and what's bad and all those sort of things. And I think I'm going to do that after the break. Today's show is sponsored by Equinix. We all utilize multiple cloud providers, and we know they aren't built to work well together. Things get a whole lot more complex when your hybrid infrastructure needs to connect with your multi-cloud portfolio. Equinix is the world's digital infrastructure company, providing on-demand infrastructure in over 25 metros with hands-free provisioning and management, all connected to over 240 data centers and most major cloud providers. Equinix can help you deal with increasingly complex architectures, whether you want to run your favorite Kubernetes distribution or connect workloads between different cloud providers. To learn more, sign up at deploy.equinix.com and use the coupon code CLOUDCAST, CLOUDCAST, to get $500 in credits to get started today. That's deploy.equinix.com and use the coupon code CLOUDCAST and get those first $500 in credits today. Are you looking to stay ahead of the curve in the latest trends in enterprise tech? Look no further than the Breaking Analysis podcast with Dave Vellante. This data-driven program dives into the most important topics facing the enterprise tech industry today. With a data-first approach that leverages ETR's renowned surveys of IT decision-makers and insight from the CUBE community, Breaking Analysis delivers in-depth research on the most important topics facing technologists and IT buyers. Whether you're a business leader, an IT professional, investor, or just an avid follower of the industry, this podcast is a must-listen. Just search Breaking Analysis Podcast wherever you get your podcast and tune in today to stay ahead of the game in enterprise tech. And we're back. And I should have mentioned this at the top of the show, but one of the things that we have started to do as Twitter has started to, become, I guess, less relevant, less trustworthy, maybe. So we publish our show obviously through a a podcast aggregator. So all of you are listening to the podcast on whatever application or channel that you get your podcasts on. It could be on the web, it could be on your phone, could be however. And then typically we publish the details of it out on a bunch of different social media channels, platforms. Twitter for the longest time had really been probably the one that we had the most engagement on, because that's where a lot of the tech community had done a lot of engagement. So we had spent a lot of time on Twitter. Thank you to all the folks who listen to us on Twitter, follow us on Twitter. But we would also publish it on LinkedIn. We'd publish it on Facebook. There's a few other places, but we never really published it on Instagram or TikTok or anything along those lines, because they felt like they were really more kind of for personal things. But it does feel like with the advent of things like Threads, and Threads being integrated with Instagram and some other stuff, and a lot of people starting to enjoy getting information and news from TikTok, we are going to start publishing some stuff out there. So if you're interested in what we're publishing, we're doing some show recaps, some behind the scenes stuff. I've been doing some stuff from the Massive Studios. Those are over on TikTok and they're on Instagram. They are on the same channel or the same handle as we use on Twitter. So at the Cloudcast.net. So if you'd like to follow along, please do so. Getting back to our topic. So anyway, I went out took the family for a vacation before one of my oldest children goes off to college. She wanted to go see the national parks. So we went off to Wyoming, which is in the western part of the United States, to an area called Grand Teton. The nearest city is Jackson Hole, which is sort of a strange place because it's sort of a cowboy town, a western town. It's actually pretty low key, but it happens to be a place that a lot of very wealthy people tend to go to. I think mostly for skiing, where the weather's nice. Anyways, we went primarily for the national parks, not for the super fancy stuff. It's kind of not our style. Anyways, as we were exploring the area, seeing animals, horseback riding, going and hiking and all sorts of stuff, we learned a little bit about the history of that whole area and the whole history of national parks, the national park system, in the United States. I'll put some links in the show notes. But one of the things that was really interesting to me was, as we were driving along, I saw a sign for a road that was called John Rockefeller Avenue. It was, the road was named after John Rockefeller. And for anybody who doesn't know John Rockefeller or the Rockefeller family, it's probably a name if you're of a certain age in the United States, you've probably heard of the Rockefeller family. They were one of the first truly incredibly wealthy families. John D. Rockefeller was the creator of a company called Standard Oil, which was probably one of and I should probably get all the history of this. I'll probably find some stuff and put it in the show notes. I don't know if they were the very first sort of oil company in the United States, but they were so big and so powerful in the United States that they actually were the first company that faced monopoly lawsuits from the United States government, because other companies who tried to be in the oil business felt that they just had become so big that there was just no way in the world to compete in the oil space. And so Standard Oil, it was founded by John Rockefeller, eventually was broken up, became some other things. Again, I'll put some links in the show notes. You don't need all the history. But literally were, in the earliest days, there are a number of families in the United States who have gone on to, great fame and fortune and prominence. The Vanderbilts, the Gettys, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies. There's a bunch of them. Kind of the early wealthiest families. You can call them robber barons. You can have whatever kind of tags you want to put on them, but incredibly wealthy people. And so obviously, the reason I bring this up is when I saw that name, I thought, okay. That's a guy who was in the oil business. Oil and natural parks don't seem to necessarily go together. And, they talked about how the Rockefeller family had donated an enormous tracts of land in order to basically create the foundation of what would become the national park around Grand Tetons. And Grand Tetons is this just amazingly beautiful mountain range in Wyoming, part of the Rocky Mountain that are in the western part of the United States. And so I was very curious, how we got to this stage where, somebody's family who on the surface you would say, those two things don't tend to go together, right? Massive amounts of wealth, possibly exploitation of the land, and just huge donations in order to preserve the land. And so, as I did a little bit of research, come to find out that it was his son. So John D. Rockefeller, the original sort of father, patriarch of the family. So his son was a great conservationist and was very, very interested as he traveled out to the western part of the United States, in understanding the land, understanding these amazing landforms, and how he could potentially be part of trying to conserve this because of the potential destruction as capitalism and growth and other things happened. As the population of the United States expanded west. So turns out one of the things that he did is he went about doing something that's very similar, if you're familiar with the story of Disney, of how Disney basically bought up the land around Orlando, Florida, that eventually would become Disney World and the entire sort of Disney complex that's around Orlando, Florida, that so many, millions of people visit every year. And so essentially what he did is he said, I would really, really like to, create this sort of conservationist capability around this area. But I don't own the land and I can't just sort of dictate what happens. And there was some interesting things that were going on at the time in terms of statehood and where the federal government's powers lay and the state government's powers lay and so forth. But anyways, what he ended up doing, again, similar to what Disney did, is he said, I would like to buy up this land and I'm willing to pay a fair price for it, but I don't want to pay like outrageous prices if people figure out that it's me trying to buy the land as a wealthy person. So he hired some third-party people to go out, negotiate with the ranchers, and basically bought up about 35,000 acres of land. Now, what was interesting about this, and what will tie together with the discussion we're going to have about technology and free and the various relationships that people in tech have with this concept of free, is, you would have thought, okay, so here's somebody who, yes, is a wealthy individual. You can have your opinion about what that means, good or bad. But he was, in essence, he had taken his wealth and he was trying to do something that was for the public good, was going to, wanted to donate it back to the United States, wanted to ask that it be used as part of a nature preserve that could be used as part of the national park system, which is beginning to expand in the United States and so forth. And so you would think, okay, this person's doing a nice thing. Seems like a useful thing, and he's giving it to the country and to anybody who wants to visit essentially for free, right? And what was interesting about that was once people found out that this was happening, right? Ranchers started talking to other ranchers, or the government of the local area found out about this. They got very upset. They got very upset because for various reasons, they felt like maybe they had been misled. They felt like they had been robbed of their land, right? Even though this was not a situation in which, it was actually stolen, it was actually bought and paid for, through proper means and channels. And they were frustrated, I think, mostly because they felt like, well, maybe we weren't in the loop as to what happened. Maybe this wasn't communicated to us as well as could possibly happen. Anyways, what was very interesting about this story was you would have thought that people would have sort of embraced it. Again, it's free. They're keeping the natural land the way it's supposed to be. They're not going to, they're going to prevent people from coming in and farming and drilling and mining and all sorts of things that could destroy this area. It took 25 years before the protests and the working with the government and all the paperwork to complete the transaction of giving something away for free to back to the state of Vermont, of Wyoming, in order to be used for this national park as part of a national park system to preserve these things that people sort of loved. And everybody, as part of the process, was compensated at fair market value. And the reason I bring all that up is it seems like over the last couple of weeks, and again, I've been slightly out of the loop in terms of some of the technology over the last couple of weeks. I've been transitioning day jobs and doing some vacation stuff and doing some family stuff. But what was really interesting to me was sort of what felt like a little bit of this parallel in that you had a couple of situations over the last couple of weeks, whether it was, Facebook here recently open sourcing something called Llama 2. Well, putting out Llama 2 out into the open. I said open sourcing and misspoke there, but we'll kind of get to that. Red Hat making some changes in terms of how CentOS works. But we've seen a number of things over the last few months, or the last year or so, in which the interaction between how technology communities view things that are free in terms of zero cost, and how they view things in terms of who is providing the framework around this thing that was free, as well as whether or not they think the things that should be free, they should be able to monetize them, or somebody else should be able to monetize them, and whether or not any of that's good, and all these sort of things. And so what I thought was sort of interesting, and let's just take the Facebook case as an example. So if you went back a couple of years and you took some public opinion polls and you said, hey, in general, what is the temperature on Facebook, right? It'd be an interesting conversation, because on one hand, you would have said, well, people must seem to like the platform because there are literally like 2 or 3 billion people that are users of the platform, daily users of the platform. And then they have a number of other platforms like Instagram that people seem to very much like. And so on one hand, yes, they are a corporation that in essence provides a free service that people get. As always, if the service is free, you are the product at that point, right? Your data becomes the service. And then the election of 2016 and the elections of 2020 in the United States came along. There's been a bunch of sort of world and global events that Facebook has influenced one way or the other, oftentimes in many people's perspective negatively. And so there was very much sort of a negative connotation, at least from a public perspective, around Facebook. And yet, people were using the service and they enjoyed the fact that it was free. So, there was a weird relationship between, I like the fact that it's free, but I don't necessarily like the owner. And I think maybe the owner makes too much money. And so I don't necessarily enjoy that, but I do enjoy the service. And, so sort of this weird relationship with free. Now, to the point where, as we all know, Facebook decided we're going to basically change the name of the company to Meta. We'd like to take Facebook sort of out of the everyday conversation people were having. Let's sort of change things up. Anyways, that doesn't go terribly well. People sort of know the story of like Meta and Metaverse and all that stuff. Now, Twitter, which is sort of somewhat beloved by the tech community, or it had been beloved by the tech community. Granted, it had its warts, it had its issues as far as content moderation, all that sort of stuff. But again, completely free service. People seem to love the fact that it was free. There was chances for you to pay for the service. Most people chose not to pay for the service. They love the free part. They love the relationship. They love the fact that they were getting value out of this thing that they were paying nothing towards, but they were getting value out of it, maybe because they felt like, well, I've contributed to it in some way, shape, or form. I'm a great tweeter. I've built a community, whatever I've done. And then Elon Musk comes along, decides to buy the platform, makes a bunch of changes in the platform. People are frustrated with that. They're frustrated with the changes. They're frustrated with the fact that he's changed sort of his approach to the business model, in which he's now sort of encouraging people to pay for this service that previously had been free. And so again, you have this weird relationship, or this, kind of complex relationship between what's free, how you perceive value that comes out of it, who is in charge of it, whether you like the person, whether you don't like the person. Elon Musk went from somebody who a large part of the tech community really thought was interesting, thought was, in some cases a demagogue level, right? Invented Tesla, was sending rockets into space, was talking about going to Mars and doing all sorts of crazy technical things, and people put him up on a pedestal. And then he goes and buys Twitter, everybody's favorite platform for communication, basically kind of, knocks it down 2 or 3 pegs. Some would argue he's destroyed it. And then Meta comes along again. And here's Meta. And they go, hey, we just came out with this thing called Threads. And it's going to be free, just like everything else we offer. And we're going to kind of be the savior of Twitter. We're going to build a Twitter clone. We talked about it a little bit on a previous show. And people seem to think that was pretty interesting, to the point where 100 million people, now not 2 billion or 3 billion, but 100 million people, and still growing, have thought, oh, here is an alternative to this. And we really like this company. We're really excited about where this could be going. And so once again, we have this strange relationship between something that I guess is free, somebody who a couple of years ago we perceived to be a terrible person, a dislikable person, somebody we don't necessarily want to associate with. I say we in the collective we, not any particular group. But now we sort of have said, hey, we're going to forget about that because they're giving us something for free that, we now perceive as good again. And so that was sort of interesting. And so the other thing they did this last week was they released something called LLAMA or Llama 2, which is their large language model and their whole framework to sort of be kind of a counterbalance, if you will, a competitive to OpenAI. And they said, we are going to make this open source. We're going to make this openly available. And on one hand, there was a lot of people who said, oh, this is really interesting. The competitive market needs open alternatives. And yes, there are already open alternatives to OpenAI, just like there are open alternatives to Twitter in Blue Sky and Mastodon and some other things. But to a certain extent, people also said, boy, to do those things well, you need to do them at scale. You're going to need a lot of computing power, a lot of resources, probably a lot of data. And then, Meta comes along and they release this thing. And we went back through the same sort of thing where people said, well, first and foremost, this isn't open enough, right? You've made it open, but then you've made it restrictively open in terms of, there's a clause in there that says, well, this is open until the service that, builds on top of this gets to 700 million active users, in which case you can't keep using it for free. There's going to be some sort of licensing or royalty thing. So it's sort of free until somebody else builds a business on it, begins to create value on it. And then the creator of it says, hey, we did a lot of work. We think you should be contributing some aspect of that back. And the details of it, I don't know, have been fully laid out. But they allow you sort of freedom to a certain point and then some restrictions to protect themselves from a business model perspective and so forth. And it was interesting because it created a lot of conversation around, well, what does open mean? And what is the spirit of open? And is there good open, or is there sort of only restrictive open? And does one definition of open or the resultant freeness, are those the things that everybody has to live by? Or is there room in there for business models to emerge, right? For Facebook to continue to have, or Meta to have a business model, or somebody else to build a business model. And, it brought up a lot of questions of like, well, who should get to dictate what type of business models are allowed, right? Should the people who have created the technology or the most dominant in the technology, should they be allowed to do that? Should they be allowed to have some say if they are contributing a significant amount of the resources that went into something, right? And I felt like there was some parallels there to the John Rockefeller Jr. and Grant Teton story, in that on one hand, you had a set of people who were very interested in consuming a resource, preferably freely, not having any restrictions placed on it, because they loved the output of it. They loved the value that was created. But at the same time, they didn't necessarily, they then also had opinions on, well, is your free good enough? Does your free come from a good place? Does your free mean whatever, right? What are the downstream ramifications of it? And so I think the reason I brought all this up is that, as you're looking at various conversations that are going on in tech this week and next week, and will happen again in 6 months, and we saw it 6-8 months ago before, it's never been clean. It's never been, explicitly clear. And I know people will say, well, there are licenses around these things and so forth. Yes, that's true. There are sometimes licenses or laws or regulations around things. But what often happens as these things are discussed and as people begin to see, well, I like free and I like the value that comes from free. And I like some things around free that are good. They're good for me. They're good for me personally, or they're good for me in a small sense or even a bigger sense. And then we start to get into these things of like, well, the spirit of the license, the spirit of the agreement, the spirit of the openness. And those things are difficult to define, right? They're going to be somewhat opinionated. They're going to be somewhat biased by what you think is good for you versus are you thinking of the goodness of the broader community? And so, it just sort of, as I was, not thinking about technology, but thinking about these other sort of grandness of nature and the interaction of people and nature, and then sort of hearing this story again about, somebody who had taken their money, however they achieve their money, you can be happy with it or dissatisfied with it or disgusted by it, whatever, but then decided to take that and trying to do good with it. And it was interesting to watch how much people push back, not for a few days, for a few tweet storms, for a few news cycles, but literally for almost 2 decades in trying to push back on this complicated, freely available, how is it communicated type of thing. And so, I think as a tech community, as we start to work through some of the stuff that's out there, whether it's the Facebook thing or other things or the Meta thing or other things that are out there, I think it's important to remember historically, anytime you take communities of people, you take the concept of free, you take some resource that is allocated and made available free, there may not always necessarily be the cleanest line, the cleanest through line between both what is received, how it was created, who the creator was, what your opinion of that is. It's always going to be complicated, and that's okay. It's okay for it not to be clean. I think, we've learned over time in our tech communities and with the technology we use and so forth that, we are okay with the idea of co-creation. We're okay with the idea of various business models being able to come out of that. And we're okay with a lot of gray areas. And so, as you're reading through things, as you're trying to form opinions, just understand that what we're going through right now is by no means unique. And also it's by no means unique to just the tech industry. This is something that has been going on for many, many, many decades, in some cases, many centuries, in terms of just the interaction between fee and free and, people's perception of value and spirit of, and contracts and licenses and all these other types of things. So anyways, with that, I know we didn't get into tons and tons of technology. Quite honestly, we usually take a break around this time of the summer, but I felt like it was good to get a show out, and it just how happened that, my flight home kind of gave me a couple of things to think about. So anyways, with that, hope everybody's doing well. Hope everybody gets a chance to check out what we're doing on not only the podcast, but on Instagram and TikTok and all the other sort of media channels that we're starting to use. I'd love to have a follow from you. If you get a chance, it always helps us if you rate the show. So if you enjoy the show, go to wherever you get your show, whether it's Apple Podcast or Google or Spotify or whatever. Give us some feedback, give us a rating. We would love that. 5-star ratings are always preferred, but any feedback is always welcome. With that, I'm going to wrap it up. Hope everybody's doing well. Hope everybody's enjoying the sort of late part of July as we start to get into the late part of the summer. It's not going to be too long before the kids start going back to school. And again, schedules will all change and all that sort of stuff. So anyways, thanks for listening. Thanks for telling a friend. Thanks for helping us grow the community. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.